There you go.
The middle of a bad choice.
One question I have is, and we brought this up while observing, how well is this tool preparing and fostering, preparing students for productive communication while working on the same problem,
Mm-hmm.
like during collaboration compared to just how do you present a problem? And even with the presenting, I think there's some issues with, I think it needs to be a little bit more nuanced in terms of how much detail, how much explanation is needed based on the audience. There's something about audience and kind of voice in terms of everything doesn't necessarily need to be justified to make it a good mathematical explanation based on who the audience is.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I don't think the tool really addresses is a sense of focus or summary or kind of these things that presentations often have to help the audience orient themselves to what's going on.
You know, maybe this is the word presentation that I'm having trouble with, because when I think of mathematical communication, I don't always think of a presentation.
Right.
There are times when you have a very lengthy, very long proof, and someone is going to go through and check every single line of that proof. And then there's other times when you're trying to present a big idea, like say at a conference, and because we weren't clear on what type of presentation, I was I was okay with the way that the kids interpreted it, as long as they were making an attempt to be clear. But maybe that is something that we need to think about in the future, is if we want to direct them for an audience, are we trying to collaborate with students your age in this class? Are you explaining this to a new geometry student? Are you sharing your one big takeaway? And if that's what we're looking for, then we do need to be clear on that. There's something else you said, the first thing I was thinking about, but I lost it.
I'm just trying to remember some of the things we talked about today. I felt like, Zach, that you had mentioned how we might change the, I don't know if we're comfortable calling it a rubric, versus like advice, feedback, comments, like all those things I think should be questioned. And Zach, I felt like you were talking about like other things that we could add in, but I don't remember what those things were. Like maybe there's one element to being metacognitive, or like knowing your audience, or adjusting, or what the key points were. We
had mentioned a fifth one that maybe was on that, the idea of the summary, or of the summarizing key points, or giving a prequel in a sense, the outline of what you're going to do. But again, maybe that's dependent on the type of presentation we wanted to do. One thing and you kind of mentioned it, that we talked about a lot, we didn't actually discuss the topic, but what came up a lot was vocab. And realizing that because we're 3 teachers in 3 different buildings in 3 different cities, I think we took a lot for granted in terms of vocabulary. We didn't spend much time beforehand thinking about it, but I can think of maybe 10 different huddles where we got together and said, hey, maybe we should use this word. Oh wait, Jess, what does that word mean to your students? And we had to keep saying, and maybe that's kind of where this idea of feedback, rubric, maybe that's something you want to hash out beforehand, is what is our goal, but then what do your kids already know about these words? Is this a loaded term for them? Or is this just something new? Because you know what I mean? Like you were asking her that a lot.
And I think that's the same thing that we want our students to do by knowing their audience and knowing which words to choose and which words to. I think what you're challenging us to do is the same thing that we ought to be challenging our students to do, in terms of making sure that we have a common language with our audience, in our case our students, in their case their audience. And if we don't have that common language, if we don't have a common understanding of what these words mean, to anticipate that there's going to be misconceptions or misunderstandings, and to address those, in an appropriate way.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the word conjecture, which they use very differently. But in your class, you seem to be very comfortable with that word. Whereas if the same kid gave that same presentation to your class, may not have been nearly as...
probably would have been like, what?
Yeah. So this is a very good point that the kids maybe should be made aware of that. Well, let's go back to what was our main goal. Was, because you mentioned, is it sharing, is it collaborating, or is it presenting? What was the goal here?
When you wrote the whole, this whole proposal, I felt like you were kind of talking about presentations.
Yes, I think I was more focused on presentations, but not so much on the presentation itself,
It's
For
how
me-
people give feedback to each other on presentations.
Yes, the mathematical, like that was more the avenue. The goal was the feedback.
Mhm.
The group presentation was something that I think teachers just don't use often enough because of the time. I mean, I think if we had to watch every single one of those, would not have happened in 2 days. Might have been happening in 3 if we were lucky. But by having students give feedback to other students, we were able to get through 30 presentations in a 30-minute period. And there's just no way that would have happened otherwise. And that's what I saw as the main value was, are students able to give feedback? And we still don't even know that really.
Yeah.
We know they gave feedback, but we don't even know if they gave quality feedback. Feedback where you can step out and say, hey, no, my kids are okay with this, versus, I should be the one giving feedback in the future.
And it seemed like some students were not clear on the purpose of the feedback. I heard several students give feedback saying, if I didn't know about this, then it wouldn't have been clear to me, to indicate to me that they understood what was going on, but
Right.
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
But I might not have.
even the
Yeah.
audience of the presentations didn't really see themselves as the audience. So they were giving feedback on things that perhaps they didn't necessarily value or necessarily deem as appropriate characteristics of a quality presentation. They were following our rubric rather than really thinking to themselves, is what they're doing helping me solve the problem?
Yeah.
And one evidence of this is someone said, well, this is a 60-degree angle, and you said, so this has to be 120, but if I didn't know that, then you didn't really explain it. But they did know that. And that's where I come back to this idea of, is the feedback meant to help our students give presentations to an algebra class, which I think is a fairly limited goal for our, and one that our students probably won't realize very often, compared to just improve the way in which they communicate on a regular basis
With the person next to you.
with the person next to, with a kind of
Right.
when you do have common experiences like that.
So what? Because I see that partially coming from. We made a point of that fourth question being, not is this a presentation that you understand, but would a typical geometry student understand this? And we specifically said a typical geometry student to put you in a third-person context.
I'm wondering if that was a bad idea.
So yeah, so it sounds like
Wait,
maybe
say that one more time.
we specifically made the fourth criteria in
A
terms
typical
of putting you in a
geometry student.
third-person context.
Right.
And now Zach's saying
Although
that
I'm wondering
maybe
if-
there'd be value in taking that out and saying, because that
Yeah.
could have.
Did it help you?
Yeah.
But I wonder if they understood what that really meant.
Right. They might have, when they
Yeah.
think typical, it might have been someone who's not as advanced
Or
as
what
me.
it's exactly, they might be thinking regular geometry, not geometry enriched
Yeah.
or something like that.
Which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing.
No.
Myself, I don't see that as being overly negative.
I don't think it's negative.
It serves a different purpose. I think it serves the purpose of helping the presenter make sure that their presentation is clear and
Right.
easy to understand, but it doesn't serve the purpose in helping the presenter necessarily know the audience. I feel like there needs to be a little bit more. I think the difficult part for students is to help students when they really don't get something, and I feel like that wasn't necessarily the case for many of the setups we had.
Mhm.
It's really more like I don't think I'm not sure about this, and maybe we've got data to answer this question, but my impression was that the participants were really just assessing the presentation, not using the presentation to learn something, which
Right.
they're looking for something different there.
That'd be interesting.
So-
Yeah, we don't have the data, you're right, but that's a good question.
I feel like something that we kind of kept saying, and I felt like we did a lot more in the third class when we were giving you feedback and you were asking us like, well, what could I have done differently, or how could I have done something that would have helped. But I feel like if we want this to be something that's useful for everyday kind of collaboration, right? Then those things that we kept emphasizing, like, did you check their understanding? Did you even look around and say, like, I mean, did you
Right.
look around first of all? Did you say, like, do you get it? Like, does this make sense? Like, do you know why I did that? Like, those are the kinds of things that maybe the students need an experience to look out for. And maybe I look for eye contact, you look for how many times, like, the presenter checks understanding, and you look just to make sure that it all makes sense. maybe we have 3 lenses and we rotate those positions as
That'd be
somebody's
interesting.
presenting.
So you're saying that as audience members,
We start looking
would
for
be-
those actions.
yeah,
And somebody still has to check if it made sense or helps. You know, like maybe you have great eye contact, but you're still losing everyone.
I certainly think that in that third classroom when we did a little bit
Mhm.
more of that and we talked a
Yeah.
little bit more of that, I saw more of that in the groups, where the
Mhm.
groups felt the presenters, for
Mhm.
some reason, perhaps because we modeled it a little bit more that way, and perhaps for some other reason, but they did do more, do you understand, are you following, and kind of
Mhm.
check in.
Well, I feel the difference there was in the first 2, and you did a little more in the second one. First class, we gave feedback and you listened. Second class, we
Mhm.
gave feedback and you paused once and said, who else thought that this was quick? And then we finished.
Mhm.
And in the third one, every time we gave feedback, you basically stopped and said, oh, who agreed with that? And you turned it into a dialogue. So the
Mhm.
feedback was not a summative, a summation of what you did. The feedback became, it seemed to me, more of a conversation. And I do think that transferred to the kids because I saw a lot of them stopping each other
Well,
mid-presentation
yeah.
and, oh, wait. Where in the first 2 classes, they actually asked in the first period, oh, we were allowed to stop them?
Mhm.
Like, I think they saw this feedback as a summative thing because we modeled it that way.
Mhm.
Which is weird because those are the nuances. You don't even know you're modeling. Had we not done this 3 times, there's no way I would have picked up on
Right.
that.
Right.
But because we changed it and did it a 3rd time, I really think they pick up on those subtle nuances.
Well, and I think that because more of the student's voice was, you know, present in that conversation, it probably showed other
Yeah.
students in the class, like, it's not just the teachers that can give this kind of feedback, it's like the people next to me or...
Yeah,
Mhm.
which I think was really cool. And that it kind of leads into, I don't know if this is too soon, but I want to get to this question at some point before we go, is status.
Mm-hmm.
And part of this being, why is it that I can present a mathematical concept better than a lot of the people I grew up with? And part of it was probably because after years of having that status and years of saying, hey guys, I'm talking, listen, I learned to talk well. And think about, is this beneficial for the students who maybe have those ideas? And as freshmen, this is great because we're catching them young in a sense. Instead of waiting till they're a senior and they've had 4 years of, these guys have been talking a lot. I've never talked in class and now you're telling us we got to present the same. Well, he's a naturally good, they start thinking this is natural.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you guys think about the role of status in taking the time to make every student present, A, individually, not as a group, and B, giving that feedback too as an individual, not as a group? Like, do you think this was a beneficial thing as far as status, or?
I think it certainly had the potential to both be beneficial and perhaps
Harmful.
not good. And I saw some individuals, one I mentioned to you, that get
Right.
feedback that probably reiterated conceptions of, you know, difficulty of explaining things and confusion and not prepared and things like that.
Mhm.
And so this, although in our minds we had a lot of support and time to try to set them up for a successful experience,
Yeah.
some students were not ready or didn't feel comfortable or didn't give an effective presentation, which, you know, was obviously public for their group,
Right.
and perhaps served to reiterate or reinforce the ideas that their classmates already had on them.
But we should also read that student's reflection on
Right.
how they interpreted the feedback.
Right.
Because the
Luckily,
student you
that's
brought
something
up
we
for
can-
me, I wasn't really so concerned about, is this gonna further like solidify her identity as this kind of flippant person who is confused and isn't prepared. You know, like I
Mhm.
wasn't as concerned about that. And I'm not sure exactly why, but I would be curious to see
Yeah,
what
that
she
would
says
be-
about how she felt about the feedback.
And I have a specific question for when we look at their feedback is
Yeah.
because a lot of times that student who's unprepared in a group presentation, and Jess and I mentioned this briefly, I don't know if you're part of that conversation, is in a group presentation, they're the one that everyone has to participate. So they say, guys, here's the problem, here's what we tried to do, here's what,
Mhm.
like they read the directions,
Right.
and then they step off to the side, and we never
Right.
see them again. So even though the group gets feedback, that was never really for them. And to put someone, I don't want to say on the spot, but not on the spot so much that you're talking in a class of 30, but on the spot where 3 of your peers are looking at you and saying, how did you solve this?
Mhm.
It might have been beneficial for some of those kids. Maybe it could have reinforced a low status, but on the other side, it could have actually put a little bit of pressure on them. And I do think peer pressure from peers is different than pressure
Yeah,
from
we did
teachers.
talk about this.
And so it'll be really interesting to see how they interacted to that. Is yeah.